The other day on the subway, I saw something that for about 10 seconds almost tricked me into feeling optimistic about our species. A woman dropped her wallet and a whole life's worth of plastic and paper scattered across the grimy floor. Before she even noticed, a young guy knelt down, quickly gathered every last piece, and handed it back to her with a perfect, reassuring smile. A few people nearby nodded in approval, a perfect little diorama of civic virtue. But as the guy walked past me to his friend, I heard him mutter, "Had to give it back, way too many cameras in the station." And in that instant, the entire moral performance collapsed. That kindness wasn't an impulse from some glowing inner core, it was a cold, paranoid calculation, a gesture for the unseen audience of security lenses. It made me start to wonder, what if all of it is? What if our entire moral code is just a counterfeit currency we use to transact with each other, born not from compassion, but from the simple primal fear of getting caught? So that unsettling, misanthropic view, this idea that our core morality is basically a sham and cooperation is just, well, purely strategic. That's exactly what we're diving into today. Our mission really is to explore this challenging idea. We're going to try and dissect apparent goodness, see if we can find the ruthless calculation underneath. We'll be looking at this notion that cooperation isn't intrinsic, that it's strategic, using evidence from three pretty different fields: evolutionary psychology, then the sort of mathematical certainty of game theory and behavioral economics, and finally, the, let's call it, cynicism of international relations realism.
It is a really compelling lens, isn't it, though? Profoundly dark, you might say, to view human behavior this way. Today we are essentially peeling back those layers of apparent altruism, trying to find the self-interested mechanism right there at the core. We're going to trace the logic of self-preservation, starting from the smallest unit, our genes, and work our way up through our immediate social interactions, and then finally to the really massive scale of statecraft. We really have to ask, are these seemingly selfless actions just, sophisticated manifestations of self-interest, whether that interest is measured by like genetic propagation or maybe personal utility or even national survival? And if that is the case, how does that change how we understand morality itself?
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this unsettling idea. Let's start at the most fundamental level, our biology. We're starting small, like you said, with the DNA. And there's a story here that really strips away all the romance from family loyalty. It's about two brothers, Jan and Marek, from a small village in Poland during those really difficult economic times in the 1990s. Now, on the surface, the story looks like this heartbreaking example of sacrifice, right? Jan, he's the older brother, physically strong, hardworking. But he recognized that his younger brother, Marek, he was the brilliant one. He was the family's only real shot, their ticket out of generations of poverty. So Jan, he didn't really hesitate. He just quit school altogether, took on the most grueling, just back-breaking jobs he could find, shipyard, farms, you name it. And he funneled every single spare zloty he earned to Marek, so Marek could go off and pursue an advanced education in Warsaw.
Right, and this kind of self-sacrifice, where someone just forgoes their own chances for a relative.
Yeah.
It's often held up as the absolute gold standard, isn't it? Unconditional love, virtue. The villagers, well, naturally, they praised Jan, saw him as this kind of local saint.
Exactly. But years later, right after Marek became this hugely successful civil engineer, and he did lift the whole family out of poverty, bought Jan a secure farm, funded the next generation's education. Well, Jan's son told this story about a moment of profound clarity. An old friend was praising Jan, going on about his incredible sacrifice, calling him a saint. And Jan just sort of paused, looked away, and muttered this quote that just perfectly nails our cynical premise today. He said, "It wasn't a sacrifice, it was an investment."
An investment, wow.
Yeah. He said, "I bet on the right horse. Marek's mind was better than my back for ensuring our name survives. I just did the math."
That phrase, "I just did the math." That is essentially the foundation of modern evolutionary psychology, especially when you interpret it through the lens of the selfish gene theory, which Richard Dawkins really popularized. It's a tough concept to swallow, mostly because it completely reorients the whole unit of analysis.
Can you elaborate on that reorientation? Because it feels really jarring to hear ourselves described as just, vehicles. Does this selfish gene idea imply that even something like deep parental love is just a really successful program designed for, propagation?
At the most basic biologic level, yes, it does. Dawkins argued that we as individuals were merely throwaway survival machines. That's his term. We're temporary, perishable bodies vessels, essentially designed and manipulated by the real, immortal units of selection. our genes. These genes, they're effectively like internal dictators. Their sole purpose, relentless and unforgiving, is just to propagate copies of themselves into the next generation. They dictate complex behaviors like caring for kin, not because of subjective love, but simply because those behaviors are the most efficient ways to ensure the gene survives and replicates itself.
So Jan's act, his selfless act of funding Merrick's education, biologically speaking, it wasn't about subjective love for his brother. It was more like extremely effective long-term genetic accounting for their shared DNA.
Precisely. Yeah, that's exactly it. And this is where William Donald Hamilton's concept of inclusive fitness comes in. Historically, you see, people mostly measured evolutionary success just by direct fitness, like how many of your own kids survive and reproduce. Hamilton expanded this idea. Inclusive fitness includes that direct fitness plus something called indirect fitness. That's the success of the survival and reproduction of your relatives, the ones who share those same genes. So by investing in Merrick, Jan was, biologically speaking, maximizing his indirect fitness payoff.
Okay, this sounds like a biological cost-benefit analysis. How cold does the math actually get here?
It gets extremely cold. Hamilton actually formalized it into a simple predictive formula. It's known as Hamilton's rule, and ACA. Okay, let's unpack that a bit. An altruistic act, the thinking goes, will evolve and become stable in a population if the cost, that's this to the actor. So in Dan's case, losing his education, the hard labor.
Right, the cost to him.
Is less than the degree of relatedness. That's the R to the recipient multiplied by the benefit B to the recipient.
Okay, let's try using some specific numbers just to make that calculus really clear for, for everyone listening.
Right, sure. Relatedness, the R, that's the really key variable here. So for a full sibling, like Merrick was to Jan, R equals 0.5. They share, on average, 50% of their genes. Now, for a niece or nephew, like Merrick's future children are, is 0.25. If Jan had sacrificed everything for, say, a distant cousin, R might only be 0.125 or even less. So the less related the recipient is, the higher the benefit, the B, must be to justify that cost seed.
Okay, so if Jan's own expected benefit, his B was maybe low, perhaps he knew he wasn't academically gifted, but Merrick's potential benefit, his B, was exceptionally high. Like Merrick had the potential to become this globally successful, maybe highly fertile individual.
Yep.
Then the dollar times B value for Merrick, that calculation, it dramatically outweighed the cost C to Jan. So Jan was basically sacrificing a small sort of low-yield investment himself for a potentially massive high-yield return on their shared genetic portfolio through Merrick.
That is the biological logic, stripped bare.
Yeah.
It means the decision to sacrifice for a brilliant sibling is, mathematically, more sound than sacrificing for a less gifted sibling, or sacrificing for a distant relative. Even if the subjective feeling, the love, feels identical. The behavior is beneficial, sure, but the ultimate motive, unseen and unfelt by Jan himself, is just relentless genetic propagation. It really investigates how evolutionary success isn't just about your kids, but about promoting the survival of anyone who carries your shared genes.
But hang on, doesn't focusing purely on R and B, doesn't that kind of overlook the complexity of the real world? I mean, what happens when someone sacrifices for a non-relative? Does the theory just say, oh, that was a mistake, a miscalculation?
No, the theory adapts. It introduces reciprocal altruism. This is where self-interest can extend beyond your immediate family because cooperating benefits you in the long run. The old, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Yeah. But even this kind of cooperation among non-kin, it's still driven by an expectation of future return. It's conditional kindness, really, the ultimate driver. Still the successful survival of the individual carrying those genes. And this brings us right back to that provocative claim from Dawkins, which I think really sums up this whole section. Let us try to teach generosity and altruism, because we are born selfish. The implication here is absolutely critical, meaning genuine, unconditional altruism. It must be a cultural intervention. Something deeply learned, culturally enforced, a behavior designed specifically to suppress or maybe override our fundamentally selfish biological nature. If our genes hardwire us for ruthless self-interest, then morality, from this biological viewpoint, it has to be an artificial construct. Necessary, maybe, but artificial.
Okay, and if morality is an artificial learned construct, then it must also kind of evolve and propagate successfully within the culture itself, right? This sounds like where the idea of memes comes in those self-replicating cultural units.
Exactly, yeah. When we talk about memes here, we're not talking about internet pictures. We mean concepts, moral codes, phrases, ideas, things that have high survival value within the cultural environment. Just like genes propagate by being good at survival in the biological environment, ideas propagate by being good at, say, psychological appeal or social enforcement.
So a moral code like thou shalt not steal, it isn't successful because it's inherently objectively good, but because societies that adopt that rule tend to be more stable, and therefore they're better at surviving, replicating, and passing that idea along.
Precisely. The moral system itself becomes a successful strategy for maintaining large cooperative groups. And that, in turn, is a key advantage for the individuals within that group. I mean, look at the idea of God or maybe an afterlife. These are incredibly successful memes, arguably.
Why?
Well, because they answer these deep, troubling questions about existence. They promise ultimate justice, things like that. That secures their spot in the meme pool, you could say, regardless of empirical truth. They provide this powerful, high-utility framework that encourages cooperation and discourages cheating. It's like having an unseen eternal camera watching us all, enforcing the rules.
That's a fascinating bridge. So if biology dictates the selfish core and culture enforces morality through these successful memes, how do we get durable social order among strangers, people who don't share immediate genes or maybe even cultural consensus? The mechanism as we transition now into game theory, it seems it's not based on love or even fear of eternal damnation, but on pure, cold, rational choice. Okay, let's shift focus then to human social interaction and the fundamental fragility of cooperation. There's an anecdote here that perfectly illustrates how easily a long-established moral code can just shatter when the underlying calculation changes. Picture, if you will, this small, isolated fishing village, maybe northern Japan, perhaps a generation or so ago. It thrived on this unwritten, seemingly virtuous code.
Yeah, they had this highly functional shared system worked out.
Yep.
The fishermen, they'd coordinate their days off, right, to ensure sustainable catch rates. They shared valuable info about where the fish were running. They collectively maintained expensive gear, their ethical system, their local morality. It looked like pure communal harmony, a real model of selflessness.
But the reality, as you hinted, was that this system was really just a strategic truce. It held together because the cost of defecting, of cheating, was too high, and the environment was basically static. Things didn't change much until a large external corporation arrived. Everything changed then. They made this massive, life-changing, one-time offer to the head of just one family, a guy named Kato-san, for exclusive fishing rights in the key zones.
Right, and this is the moment of crisis for the whole system. Kato-san knew, absolutely knew, accepting the offer would instantly destroy the village's communal code. It would guarantee the overfishing of the entire bay. But here's the strategic calculation he faced. He reasoned, okay, if I refuse this offer, what happens? The company will just go offer it to my neighbor, and then the neighbor after that. Eventually, someone will take it. The cooperation system is doomed anyway, and if that happens, he and his family are left with nothing. So he took the high-stakes deal. He defected spectacularly.
Wow. So the ethical system, which had seemed so profound, maybe even sacred, it was just revealed to be entirely conditional, only valid as long as the economic variable stayed the same, as long as the cost of cheating was too high. This, I take it, is a perfect real-world example of the prisoner's dilemma PD game.
It really is. It's foundational to game theory. And game theory itself, it's basically a mathematical toolkit designed specifically to model these strategic interactions. Situations where the outcome for one person depends entirely on what others do at the same time. The prisoner's dilemma is so powerful because it models situations where individual rationality leads straight to collective irrationality. Let's quickly walk through the payoffs just to show why individual rationality dictates betrayal. Even if both players know that cooperating would actually be better for them as a group. Imagine two partners in crime, right? Facing separate choices. Cooperate, stay silent, or defect, betray the other. Okay, scenario one. If both cooperate, see, they both get a mediocre but maybe respectable payoff. Let's say 3 years in prison each, or maybe a $3 payoff in an economic version. Scenario two. If one defects and the other cooperates, DC, the defector gets the absolute best outcome, goes free, maybe gets $5, the cooperator. They get the worst possible outcome, say 10 years in prison, or $0. And scenario three. If both defect, DD, they both get a bad outcome, but maybe not catastrophic, like 5 years each or a $1 payoff.
Okay, looking at those numbers, betrayal really does seem unavoidable. Why is defect that third scenario, why is that the Nash equilibrium?
Right, because defection is what we call the dominant strategy for the individual. The rational individual actor asks themselves just two simple questions. Question one, okay, if the other player cooperates, what's best for me? Well, if they cooperate, I should defect because getting $5 is better than getting $3. Question two, okay, what if the other player defects? What should I do then? Well, if they defect, I should still defect because getting $1 is better than getting $0.
Oh, okay. No matter what the other person does, defecting gives you a better personal outcome.
Exactly. In every scenario, Defection maximizes the individual's utility, their payoff. So the resulting defect outcome is the Nash equilibrium, because once both players are defecting, neither one has an incentive to unilaterally switch back to cooperation. If you switch back alone, you get the worst outcome, $0. And that is the paradox. The individually rational choice leads directly to a collectively suboptimal outcome. Economists call it Pareto inferior. The fishing village story shows this perfectly. Morality shatters when the interaction is seen as short-term or very high stakes because individual self-interest dictates betrayal.
Okay, so if following our own individual rationality just leads us to this miserable state of perpetual defection, how does society even exist? How do we stop this endless cycle of rational betrayal? I mean, if Cato-san represents that single-round calculation, how did we get the thousands of years of human cooperation that built cities and, well, everything?
The game changes completely. When we introduce the iterated prisoner's dilemma, cooperation only really emerges and becomes stable when the interaction extends over an indefinite number of moves. It's the future possibility of interaction, the leverage the other person has over you because you might meet again. That's the necessary condition for cooperation to stabilize. We call this the shadow of the future.
Right. So the stability doesn't come from some sudden moral awakening, but from the fear of future retaliation. Or maybe the expectation of future benefit if you keep cooperating. It's just pure long-term utility maximization again.
Precisely. Yeah, that was the big takeaway from Robert Axelrod's famous computer tournaments back in the day. He had all these different strategies for the iterated prisoner's dilemma compete against each other over thousands and thousands of rounds. And the surprising winner, it was the simplest strategy submitted, tit for tat, TFT. TFT is dead simple. It starts by cooperating on the very first moves. Then it just mirrors whatever the opponent did on the previous move. If they cooperated last time, you cooperate this time. If they defected last time, you defect this time. It succeeded not because it was the cleverest or most complex, but because it was the most robust. It just worked well against almost everything else.
Okay, we need to dig into why TFT is so robust. You mentioned it has 4 key properties. If this is supposed to be the blueprint for strategic cooperation, let's break down those components. What makes it tick?
Right, the 4 success properties. They're really critical for survival in any iterated system, any long-term relationship. First, TFT is nice. What does that mean? It's never the first one to defect. It always starts by offering cooperation, setting a positive tone. Second, it's provocable. It responds immediately and swiftly to defection. If you cheat TFT, you get punished in the very next round. No delay. This ensures the cost of cheating is felt right away, hopefully making it higher than the benefit. Third, and this one's maybe the most subtle, it's forgiving. As soon as the opponent switches back to cooperation, TFT immediately returns to cooperation too. It doesn't hold a long grudge. This is crucial because it allows the relationship to get back on track, back to being mutually profitable.
Wait a second. If it's all just pragmatic self-interest, why is forgiveness part of the winning strategy? Wouldn't holding a grudge, prolonged punishment, be more rational to deter future cheating?
You'd think so, maybe, but not in an iterated game. Holding long grudges leads to these spirals of mutual, endless defection, back to the miserable D equilibrium, which is ultimately poor for both players. Forgiveness, or maybe better put, the willingness to re-engage cooperatively is actually rational because it maximizes the chances of getting back to the mutually beneficial seat. It's not forgiveness in the moral sense, like absolution. It's just pragmatic re-engagement once the cost of continuing the conflict is proven too high for both sides. And finally, the 4th property. TFT is clear. Its pattern cooperate first, then mirror is really easy for the opponent to recognize and adapt to. They can quickly learn the rules of engagement. Cooperate and we both benefit, defect, and you'll be punished immediately. And you see this playing out in the real world. The famous live and let live system that just spontaneously emerged in the trenches during World War I is a prime example. Small units of soldiers faced each other day after day, week after week. That created an indefinite relationship, right? So, soldiers, often completely against orders from high command, frequently stopped shelling each other's supply routes, or they stopped conducting aggressive nighttime raids. They found ways to cooperate.
They achieved this sort of tacit cooperation, didn't they? Even though they were technically mortal enemies.
Absolutely. One side might signal cooperation by, say, firing a symbolic, harmless artillery shell at exactly 9 a.m. every single morning, landing it in the same empty field. If the other side didn't retaliate aggressively, they understood the truce was holding for the day. Cooperation emerged implicitly, based purely on expected reciprocity and the sheer durability of their relationship. They knew they'd be facing each other again tomorrow. The stability of that cooperation was maintained simply because defection, which meant everyone starts shooting to kill again, was just unprofitable and dangerous in the long run for everyone in that trench. It became this highly stable, self-policing agreement between essentially egoistic actors trying to survive.
Okay, before we move on, we really have to pause and address that philosophical point you raised earlier. It sounds a bit like game theory assumes people are only interested in maximizing things like money, or maybe just avoiding prison time. Is that fair?
No, that's a crucial clarification and a common misconception. Game theory itself is descriptive. It's just a mathematical framework. It doesn't actually assume human nature is narrowly selfish in that way. The payoff function in the model, it simply represents an individual's well-ordered preferences, whatever those might be. Now, those preferences do have to conform to certain mathematical consistency requirements, like transitivity. That's important.
Can you just quickly explain transitivity again? Simply?
Sure. It just means if you prefer option A, say a quiet evening at home, to option B, a loud party, and you also prefer option B to option C, like getting a root canal, then to be rational in this framework, you must prefer option A to option C. Your preferences have to be consistent. If your preferences are all over the place, A, B, B, C, but C, A, then game theory can't really model your choices effectively. But as long as your preferences are consistent, even if those preferences are entirely altruistic, like you prefer donating to charity over buying something for yourself, you are still technically maximizing your payoff according to the game model. You're maximizing the utility you get from fulfilling your altruistic preference. So the problem isn't really the theory itself, it's potentially the modeler. If a real-life person cooperates in a prisoner's dilemma experiment because they value, say, the reputation for trustworthiness, maybe worth $3 to them, more than they value the immediate monetary gain of defecting, worth $5, then the person running the experiment simply mislabeled or misunderstood that player's true preferences. The player is maximizing their preference for maintaining a good reputation, which is still a form of self-interest, arguably just a much broader one than pure greed.
Okay, that truly reframes cooperation then. It becomes a rational choice to be nice, simply because being nice, or at least acting nice, is often the long-term utility-maximizing strategy in an iterated social game. So, if self-interest, broadly defined, governs individual and small group cooperation, how does this cynical calculus scale up to the level of nations, especially when they seem to lack any definitive shadow of the future enforcement mechanism like a world government? Right, let's move now to the global stage. We can introduce this idea of national egoism with the story of an aid worker. She started out deeply idealistic, stationed in a Southeast Asian nation, helping oversee the construction of this gleaming, modern hospital, funded entirely by her wealthy Western home country. And she genuinely perceived this as a pure act of humanitarian goodwill, a tangible beacon of compassion.
Yeah, and that's exactly how the public back home typically views foreign aid, isn't it?
Yeah.
As this unconditional moral imperative, a selfless extension of wealth from the rich to those in need.
But her idealism started to erode, slowly. She began noticing the small print. Like, the hospital exclusively used extremely expensive medical equipment, and it mandated using contractors only from her home country, which effectively routed a significant chunk of the aid money right back to the donor nation's economy, and worse, the hospital site itself. Well, its medical necessity for the immediate local population was kind of questionable, but it just happened to be strategically located very near a planned deepwater port that was being financed by a global rival power. The final moment, the complete disillusionment, came when she overheard the project director talking candidly. He didn't call the facility a hospital, he called it a foothold, and a very expensive flag. It wasn't primarily about saving lives first, it was about projecting power, securing influence, and basically tethering this developing nation to the Western power sphere through dependency.
Oof, yeah. And this kind of strategic calculus, it's the very bedrock of classical realism in the field of international relations. Realism basically posits that the international system is just a global echo of that primal, cynical human nature we were just discussing in the biology and game theory sections. Classical realists, drawing heavily on foundational thinkers like Thucydides, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, they argue that state behavior is driven by a fundamental, unchanging human nature, which is characterized by self-interest, fear, and something they call the animus dominandi, this deep-seated desire to dominate or at least rule wherever possible. Hans Morgenthau, a key 20th century realist, famously argued that politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature.
So if you were to model the global system using game theory, the international stage becomes the ultimate single-round prisoner's dilemma. Is that the idea? Because there's no world police, no central authority. The system is fundamentally anarchic.
Precisely. That anarchy, that lack of a higher authority, it allows states to express their self-interested power-seeking nature pretty freely without much restraint beyond what other states can impose. In this view, states are the primary actors. Survival is their absolute first goal, but the constant pursuit of power is their primary method for ensuring that survival. This is why Thucydides, in recounting the Melian dialogue during the Peloponnesian War, famously summarized the brutal dynamics of power by having the Athenian state, quote, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Morality, from this perspective, is largely irrelevant when survival and power are on the line. Capability and necessity dictate state action.
Okay, and this view stands in really sharp contrast to the more optimistic idealist approaches that gained a lot of traction in the 20th century, right?
Okay.
Specifically thinking about neoliberalism here, which focused so much on economic interdependence.
That's exactly right. Neoliberalism, especially after WWII, argued that highly intertwined global economies and shared international institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the WTO would eventually make war rationally unprofitable. The idea was that this complex interdependence would act sort of like the shadow of the future we saw in game theory. It would incentivize cooperation over conflict because conflict would disrupt mutually beneficial trade.
But history seems to suggest that that idealist view was, well, pretty fragile, especially when it confronted the reality of deep-seated national egoism and maybe non-material motivations.
Yeah, the catastrophic failure of that idealist vision is probably best illustrated by the outbreak of World War I. You had these highly interconnected European nations, their financial systems, their trade routes, all deeply intertwined, and yet they plunged into this vortex of self-destruction. It proved quite devastatingly that these non-material impulses, what realists often summarize with the trinity of fear, honor, and interest, can easily override seemingly rational economic calculations. The fear of a rival gaining just a slight power advantage, the demand for national honor or prestige, the pursuit of perceived political interest. These proved to be far more potent drivers than the stability offered by, say, trade revenue.
And this kind of systemic mistrust, it leads directly to one of the most tragic concepts in international relations theory, the security dilemma.
Ah, yes, the security dilemma. It's this inevitable, often cyclical trap. A state tries to increase its own security, maybe by building up its military, forming alliances, or perhaps even building a strategically placed hospital foothold near a rival's planned port. But because of the inherent egotism and deep mistrust among actors in this anarchic system, the rival state almost inevitably sees this defensive move as potentially offensive, or at least deeply threatening. And so it reacts by increasing its own capabilities to compensate. This leads to a competitive spiral, an arms race, which can happen even if no state genuinely desires conflict initially. It happens because every state feels it must assume the worst intentions of its rivals to guarantee its own survival.
And we can see this kind of strategic egoism playing out historically, right? Even across supposed religious or ideological lines, which just reinforces this cynical premise that ideology often takes a backseat to raw power politics.
Oh, absolutely. A phenomenal historical example is Cardinal Richelieu of Catholic France during the chaotic 30 Years' War back in the 17th century. Richelieu, serving as the chief minister to the French king, recognized that the powerful Catholic Habsburg dynasty, ruling both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, was gaining potentially hegemonic control over Europe. Now, to prevent the domination of France by the Habsburgs, Richelieu completely ignored his own Catholic ideological preference. In the name of France's national interest, what the French call raison d'etat, reason of state, he strategically funded and eventually allied France with the Protestant German princes and even Protestant Sweden.
Wow. He literally supported the ideological and religious enemies of his own faith and arguably his own country's traditional allies, purely to maximize French power and avert being dominated by a stronger, co-religious rival.
That seems like the purest form of strategic egoism imaginable on the world stage. It really is the ultimate realist calculation, isn't it? Richelieu understood, fundamentally, that the survival and relative power of the French state transcended any particular moral or religious conviction. International cooperation, from this viewpoint, whether it's foreign aid or military alliances, isn't rooted in some kind of global compassion or shared values. It's almost always a temporary, self-interested transaction. A sophisticated political truce that mirrors that tit-for-tat strategy we saw at the individual level. Because it only lasts as long as the relationship remains mutually profitable or strategically necessary for the states involved.
And this cynical calculus also means that realists have to distinguish between different types of states based on their fundamental motives, right? Not
Yeah.
all states are the same in their ambitions.
Yes, exactly. Classical realists in particular recognize this key distinction between status quo states and revisionist states. Status quo states are generally those that are relatively content with the current international order. They seek to preserve the existing balance of power, largely because it serves their current interests well. Revisionist states, on the other hand, are those that seek to fundamentally challenge and reconstruct the existing world order because they believe the current system unfairly constrains their power or denies them their rightful place. In classical realism, because it's rooted in that idea of the animus dominandi, that fundamental human desire for power, is better able to recognize that some states might be driven by a maximum desire for power, aiming for hegemony, not just the minimum level of power required for basic survival. This distinction really underscores the core misanthropic premise we've been exploring, that nations, like individuals maybe, are fundamentally driven by self-interest and a desire to dominate, often using concepts like morality, international law, or even humanitarian aid merely as convenient tools in the larger strategic game of power politics.
So this deep dive, it seems like it's pulled the thread on morality across three vastly different scales, from the microscopic gene to the individual interaction, all the way up to the nation state. And the conclusion, while definitely discomforting, is remarkably consistent across all levels.
It does seem that way. We've sort of established this chain of calculated action, haven't we? Our genes appear mathematically selfish, driving investment in kin purely for propagation. Our social cooperation emerges as a kind of strategic truce, a dynamic agreement designed to maximize long-term utility among non-kin, enforced mainly by the expectation of future interactions, that shadow of the future. And then finally, our global alliances, even actions that look like pure humanitarian aid, often reveal themselves to be primarily self-interested power plays, maybe masked in the language of virtue. The moral core seems to be, just as your opening story suggested, potentially a counterfeit currency we use for transaction.
It is disheartening, in a way. But maybe it also means that the stability of our world, such as it is, isn't actually reliant on us achieving some mythical, maybe impossible state of pure altruism. Perhaps it's just reliant on our collective ability to accurately calculate our own self-interest, but in the long term.
And, that leads to a final, maybe somewhat paradoxical thought for you, the listener, to consider. If the single most efficient, most successful strategy for survival and prosperity in any iterated system, like a modern complex society, or a long-term business partnership, or even just a tacit truce between rival nations, if that strategy really is the simple reciprocity of tit for tat, then the practical requirements of purely strategic long-term self-interest may have actually forced us, compelled us, to act in ways that are practically indistinguishable from genuine virtue. Just remember those four key properties of tit for tat again. It succeeds because it is nice, it initiates cooperation, but it's also provocable. It punishes cheating immediately. And crucially, it's forgiving. It re-engages cooperation quickly to avoid endless conflict. To survive and thrive in the long run, maybe we must, purely out of cold calculation, learn to initiate cooperation, punish cheaters swiftly but proportionately, and then immediately be willing to re-engage with cooperation to avoid those mutually harmful, destructive spirals of defection. The sheer necessity of maintaining durable, profitable relationships might compel us to perform kindness, restraint, and forgiveness. So perhaps the counterfeit currency works so efficiently, and the performance of kindness is so absolutely essential to our stable existence, that the act of being nice, for whatever underlying cynical reason, maybe that act is the foundation of our stable existence. Maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't entirely matter if the motive is purely selfish, if the resulting behavior looks and functions exactly like virtue.